I am very excited for us to finish this journey we've been going through in the Church of Us versus Them. And I'm excited that you're here this morning because our topic is where the rubber meets the road. And so I'm going to be looking for lots of examples and illustrations from you. And I think we're going to have a really, really good conversation. So I am excited to see all of your lovely faces this morning. And we always begin in prayer. So besides the stuff going on in the news, anything else we need to pray about? Okay, let me pray then. God of truth and wisdom, of love and light, thank you for letting us wake up this morning in your presence. We know that your Spirit abides with us and testifies in us that we belong to you. We are your children. So this morning we ask that you would guide and lead us by your Spirit's presence, that we would become more like Christ, and that we would bring the light of Christ into our world, a world you love very much. Help us to learn to love the world in such a way. We ask in Christ's name. Amen. I'm still admitting people to the room, so we'll have more and more people joining us there. All right, hold on. Let me see what's going on here. Live videos, get all live notifications. All right, I'm not going to hit that this morning. You know what's funny is Facebook, Zoom, and Google have all updated their securities because rooms like this are getting so much more used in the online meetings. But because they've upgraded their security, they're not all talking to each other the same way they used to. And so all of us who host these conversations are having to be very creative. I was telling the earlier group that I was part of my friend's ordination service in Vermont this morning. And so I want to say congratulations to Joe, and I'm excited for him. He was accredited with the Mennonites, actually. And so that's very exciting for him. But the Zoom wasn't working, I guess, because the host had not updated the latest version. So we all had to switch over to a Google Hangout, but it worked great. I'm glad somebody knew how to do that. So I was sort of worried as we fired this up this morning that it may not work, but I'm glad that it's working and that you're all here. Okay, so I turn notifications on. All right. Well, I always like to begin by asking any of you who actually read the book, besides my prepared stuff, if you have anything that struck you or stood out to you or that you're hoping to touch on this morning. Any initial reflections from you before we begin my prepared stuff? Okay. Well, I always like to offer just in case. Let me share with you. Oh, we have two more people coming into the room. Here we go. Okay. So, let me share with you our beginning. I prepared a PowerPoint, and it'll facilitate our conversation this morning. So, can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So this is us versus them. This is week 10 for us, and so this is where the rubber meets the road. It is the two appendices. I think that's the plural of appendix. So Fitch makes the case that the body, we talk about the church being the body of Christ, and he takes off of Ephesians chapter 1, verse 23. He puts a lot of emphasis on this idea of that being the fullness. And that's going to become a theme this morning because I think that is a very beautiful and poetic way of talking about the church politic is the presence, the fullness of Christ in the world. And it's actually one of my favorite things so far in the book because I think it's a really constructive proposal, not just diagnosing the problem, but actually proposing a solution. And so I was really grateful for that. But the one part of that I wanted to present to you is this idea. Back when I was charismatic, we used to use the word Shekinah, like Shekinah glory. Is that a term that's familiar to any of you?
No.
Okay. Some of you? So in the Hebrew Testament, the word Shekinah represented God's presence or light or glory. And so you'll see lots of stories about when God's presence shows up, people, they're blinded by the light or they fall down under the weight of glory. There's this idea of Shekinah that has a weightiness to it. And so I really love this phrase, and I want to give it to you as sort of a framing metaphor for our conversation today, which is this: that God's presence in the world is like introducing a bowling ball onto the surface of a trampoline. So if you think about a trampoline, and if you had kids' toys sort of strewn around the fabric there, and you introduced a bowling ball, it would by far be the heaviest thing on the surface and would create its own sort of divot, right, under the weight of that. So we call this gravitas. That's my way of talking about it. And you know, if the surface of the trampoline was slick enough, the other toys would begin to slide into the orbit of this weighty bowling ball. And so Shekinah is a word of weight, and that when God's presence makes itself known, there is a weight to it, and other objects begin to slide towards it. I have noticed that both in people's lives and in churches, and I would say in communities, neighborhoods, that God's presence carries a weight to it. And you've probably been around people who have this weight to them. We always talk about Jo Traw as somebody of influence around here. She's impacted so many of us. She has a glory or a weight of God's presence with her. She has an awareness of God's work, both in her life and in the church and in the world, that gives her a weightiness. And then other people are attracted to her. And so they get pulled into her sort of gravitational pull. That for me is a great illustration of the power of God's presence in somebody's lives. And one of my favorite examples about this is there was a woman in the church when I was a younger pastor. There was a woman in the church whose husband was an alcoholic. And we used to say that the bottle was the heaviest thing in the house. She had to be aware of it all the time. The other children had to navigate around, right, Dad's drinking. And then when she began to walk with God in a very powerful way, the weight, the shape of the family shifted. And some of the children ended up coming to have a faith with their mother, where they walked in God's presence, came to know God in a new way. And the whole weight of the family shifted from Dad's drinking towards Mom's faith. And it ended up reconfiguring the shape of the family. And so we used to talk about the weight of glory. This is a phrase you'll see from time to time in church history. The weight of glory is that God's presence has a heaviness to it that changes the orientation and the shape of whatever, let's say, surface that it is riding on. And I think that for us, talking about our neighborhoods, whether it's our relational networks, our families, even our own personal spirituality, that the presence of God's glory or weight or spirit has its own gravitas, a weight to it that reorients the other elements of our lives and pulls it towards. So when Fitch talked about this in the first appendix, it really caught my attention because it's a concept that has meant a lot to me over the years. And so I just wanted to propose that to you, submit that to you, and see if that resonated with you, or if that was helpful, or if that's too woo-woo. How does that sit with you?
I think of orbits.
Orbits.
But that also brings ebbs and flows.
Yes. Oh, great.
Some days I feel weighty and others I don't.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Isn't that true? Some days I really feel like my decisions are consequential, and other days I feel like I'm being blown by the wind. If you were to diagram your family or your circle of friends, if you were to take the time to diagram that, could you name, whether it's Talk and Thought on Tuesdays or right in your family and friend circles, could you name the people who carry weight, who are heavy in their influence? Right? That word picture, it works for us. Well, what Fitch is proposing is that the church, as a politic, carries that weight. That when we walk in God's presence, we actually have a depth or a heaviness to us that influences those around us. I think it's a very powerful metaphor. I'm seeing nods, so I'm gonna take that as affirmation. I'm gonna keep moving on. All right, so here are some of the implications. Back to the PowerPoint. So what I would say, this is me reflecting on Fitch here, if we just participate in the system as it is, we concede the rules of the game to the established order. So if the established order is something that we are trying to change, whether it's for issues of justice or advocacy or organizing in a way that brings greater access and prosperity to those in need, then we have to bring something to the system that challenges the system, corrects the system, and exposes the injustices built into the system. For me, that's the application of all of these ideas we've been talking about for 10 weeks.
A lot of those I could not place.
So, how does that sit with you? All right, I'm gonna make this very personal. I think that you carry more weight than you realize. And that if you bought into this idea, you would realize that in your family, in your circle of friends, in your neighborhood, in this church, and in our community, together we carry a weight that could actually change some of the things we don't like about the system as it currently exists.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. One example that just kind of comes to my mind in the context of what's happening in modern times, our church here in Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
Together since we aren't using our space anymore, we've hosted, I think it's 15 homeless people that have been living there since I think mid-April. So, I do feel like, individually maybe our weight, we couldn't support that, but together as a collective, our church has been able to, throw our weight behind an important cause.
Yeah.
Some of the groups I participate in, some of the political groups, I find that when a person begins to express himself and apply his weight, things do change.
Yeah. If you've ever been a part of a committee or a team or a task force, it is amazing, if you look at group dynamics, that if there's one person in the room who, we even use the phrase, weighs in, right, with their opinion, it can really change the shape of that conversation. So that's just with an individual. But if we as a collective take on this mentality and we say, together, what can one person do? Maybe not that much. Although sometimes one person can make a big difference, especially if they organize and advocate, right? If they vocalize what's needed and actually name the elephant in the room. One person who's willing to speak the truth can really disrupt a meeting. If you've ever been in a family system or a corporate setting or a group like an organization, and there's an elephant in the room, that silent thing can really dominate the space. And when one person names it or proposes an alternative, it's amazing how that whole room can shift.
Well, I think when there's a shift, it's also because the person or entity has some core strengths and truths that people acknowledge, and they listen to the wisdom that they have to send out.
Yes. And this is why what Fitch is proposing is interesting. He's saying that it's actually God's presence that gives us weight. I don't think I'm overstating that. I may be overstating that and putting my own spin on that. But because we are people of faith, our faith guides us and actually lends a depth and a heaviness of our conviction that we say, look, you know, as people of faith, we are guided by these truths, right? Maybe it's the golden rule, like you've proposed so many times. And that gives us not only a direction, but a depth that says, if there are elements of injustice, they must be addressed. It's not acceptable to go forward knowing that this is harmful to people who are marginalized or vulnerable. All right, I'm going to keep going with, this is great. I'm going to keep going with this. So, he talks about enemies, and I think this is a really challenging part, and it's the core of the book. If we work off of propositions, then those who oppose our view are made into enemies. This is where we get into trouble. So he says, like, if we only gather around causes, then we create animosity. And I don't know exactly how we're going to avoid this, because if we're people of deep conviction and then somebody else opposes us, there is an adversarial element that comes in, especially if you're wanting to be an agent of change.
How about love your enemies?
Love yours. Yes.
I don't think,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, blessed are the peacemakers
Yeah.
is another thing that weaves into this. How do you oppose things without, stirring up a lot of anger and animosity among people that don't share your correct point of view?
Yeah. It's tough being right all the time. Let's admit that.
Yeah, it is hard.
I don't think that we ever really change another person's mind if they are determined if they're feel that they're right.
Yeah.
You can only plant seeds.
Yep.
And then let people germinate on it. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, you should always just plant the seed and walk away and let them think about it, and let you think about, and I should think about what they're presenting, because there's usually some validity on both sides.
You know, I do agree with that. Both that being creative and asking good questions can really expose a flaw and cause a doubt in somebody's mind that they can return to later. But if you come on full front, right, in aggressiveness, then they put their defenses up, and you don't tend to make any headway in that. But if you can somehow come around, it being clever, you can come around the backside and ask questions that undermine or subvert or interrogate the assumptions that the person came in on. Then you can start, not in that moment usually, right? Because people have too much pride and ego and invested to be publicly shamed. But you can start to expose the cracks in their thinking, and then they return to it later, and they might come to you off the record and say, hey, I've been thinking about that thing you said, and I had some thought, I had some things I wanted to ask about. There's a level of grace required to be a peacemaker. Because peacemaking isn't always compromise, right? This is the thing I'm always trying to convince people is the middle way is not always the third way that we're looking for. Sometimes the third way is outside of the either-or system altogether. So peacemaking is not always compromise.
But if you don't explore both sides, you never get to that outside the box even thinking.
That's an excellent point.
But there's a thin line between a people pleaser and a sycophant.
Ooh, you got to explain that. Those are big words.
A yes man
Oh.
and a people pleaser. I can't pronounce it. Sycophant.
Yeah. Okay. You know, as part of my discipline of going through the Church of Us versus Them has been trying to both read and listen to people who I disagree with. This has been a very challenging time to do that. I have this podcast that I listen to. It's a group of conservative thinkers, and you know, some of the ways that they think about this lockdown and the COVID and the social distancing and everything, you know, they're very opposed to it because of the sacrifice that we're making for the economy. And it's been very challenging to listen to them argue and wrestle with this. And I just think I'm very glad that we chose to go through the Church of Us versus Them this spring before we knew that we were going to get hit by COVID-19. But it has been a very difficult time because the division in our culture has been exposed in a profound way. It's really amazing to try and listen to people who are on the other side and just to think, I don't even know where to start with this. We're not even working off the same data set.
It's trying to understand everyone on the angry side. They're so angry, and I think anger is like a mental health issue of our time.
If you felt as misunderstood as they do, you'd be very angry.
That is a great point, and I think...
What did you say?
John, say it again.
I said, if you felt as misunderstood as those people on the other side do, you'd be very angry as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in the 2016 election that many of us who didn't even think it was possible for that man to be elected, we don't say his name, for him to be elected, did a lot of soul searching about what do we not understand about folks who voted for him that like we're blind to and didn't even see this as a possibility. So Hillbilly Elegy and other things that became part of the conversation. But most of that has been left behind in this current crisis, and we're back to oppositional argument culture.
I think part of the problem is there's was not real clarity about. When the purpose was very clear about we were locking down because we didn't want to overwhelm hospitals and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was easier.
Mm-hmm.
But then when the unknown and we didn't have people advocating, well, we need to hold the course, then it all kind of, we became directionless and everything blew up. It was kind of like you set out the rules and then liberate Michigan all on the same day. Like, I didn't understand that.
Can I tell you my 3 favorite things about you as a congregation? I want to affirm you this morning. I got to tell you how much I love having an intelligent congregation to interact with, especially as a conversational community to compare notes. I just respect and appreciate you all so much in how you think about things. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is a consciousness that we have where we say, I know where I stand on this, but I'm also trying to understand how other people are seeing this. Now, at times that can become paralyzing, right? Analysis paralysis, we call it, where there's so much second guessing or sort of hedging our bets and putting clauses and conditions in before we speak. That sometimes they call it liberal laryngitis is one of the things we talk about, where you almost like don't want to say something because you're like, well, I haven't accounted for all of this and I don't exactly know, and I know some people are going to be, right? And we put so many conditions before we speak. But I love that even though we are people of deep conviction, that we also have whether you call it a humility or an awareness, that not everyone sees it the way we do. And so there's a cautiousness with which we enter into these conversations. I truly, truly appreciate that, because it would be easy, so easy for us to participate in the church of us versus them. Right? It's so seductive and attractive, and then we would feel self-righteous and affirmed. But I like that there's so much on our end, there's so much hand-wringing and cautiousness to say, well, but I don't want to sound angry like those who I oppose. And, I love that we're so self-reflective and self-aware, but it does lead to some problems. We will acknowledge that. But I love, and all of you have done this at various times where you have said, right, but people who see this differently, XYZ, and I just love that we're trying to account for that, and it's always somewhere in our peripheral vision. That's a difficult thing to try and do all the time. It's exhausting.
I'm opening ballots these days, and with every one I opened that voted for you-know-who, I think, oh, we have so much work to do. There's so much work to do.
Yeah.
I mean, listening and educating and listening some more
and sometimes being able to acknowledge that we're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What? We're wrong?
But I'd like to know where I'm wrong. Come on, tell me where I'm wrong. Come on.
But what in a group, it's the people who speak up out of their passion that get people's attention, as Bo was just talking about, and can turn a room. I remember it was kind of a small potatoes thing, but I remember sitting in a room, and it was in a semicircle, and we were discussing doing something, making a policy decision. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is not what we're here for. And I was like the second person from the end. And we each got to say our piece. And I said, no, this is not what we're here for. We need to do this. And so after we'd heard from everyone, we took a vote. And people switched. And it was like, whoa, what just happened? Because what people were saying before the very end where I was sitting was that they were going along with this dumb idea. And then I spoke up and we took the vote and everybody agreed with me, mostly, And I think that's the passion of youth, the idealism of young people. That was probably 30 years ago, or maybe 40. But I think that clarity of idealism drives people to speak. And there are a lot of people who are kind of sitting in the middle and going, well, I want to get along. I don't want to stick my neck out. And then somebody speaks up and people say it's kind of like they've been given permission to say, yeah, I agree with that. I'm going to take that stand also.
For me, it's like someone flips a switch for me. It's like, whoa. Take a step back and go, I didn't think about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think as I go through this process with all of us, I'm thinking, I don't want to stick my neck out. I just don't want to. And, it's hard for me to talk. Why would I try to talk? But I think we have to stick our necks out. And it's damn uncomfortable. I hate even saying that. Because I don't want to.
Well, that's what Jesus did.
It's needed.
Jesus stuck his neck out. Look where it got him.
Exactly.
I want to quote Fitch here. This is from the book, page 175. As a result, striving is increased via the empty politic. It characterizes the empty politic. People caught up in it swirl, take swipes at others, compare what they have to what others have, always see their circumstances in terms of lack rather than abundance. These people live in a state of perpetual discontent. You know, one of the things that we're up against in our culture right now is that we have, most people wouldn't be able to articulate it like this, but we have a zero-sum understanding of how things work. If 2 votes go for you, that's 2 votes that have been taken from me. If $10 go towards that cause, that's $10 that don't go to my cause. And because we are working off a lack, a poverty mentality, we lose the ability to see the common good and the greater access of abundance and overflow of supply. And so this is one of the things that we can be vocal in our, whatever our settings are, to speak against the zero-sum game of lack and poverty. I mean, that's part of why we're in the situation that we're in our country, is because this zero-sum game makes some people feel like they are on the outside or the underside, and that they are losing and that they don't have access. And so there's an animosity that grows out of that, understandably. All right, I'm going to keep going. This does not mean that there will never be conflict in the church of God's fullness. Quite the contrary, in fact. But conflict in the politic of fullness will be the means by which the church comes together in God's presence, rather than the means for it to be torn apart into sides. Here, we will not make enemies of others. We will not derive our identity from taking sides. We will not abstract conflicts and make banners of them to make war against the other. We will not take pleasure in anyone's demise. Instead, every conflict we ask, what's God doing here? That's an interesting proposal.
Oh, the saying, what would Jesus do?
Yeah. Yeah, that book, In His Steps, was like an early kind of an interesting political theology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can't picture Jesus saying we've got to agree to disagree.
No.
Right, that's what I was saying, is like compromise is not always the third way we're looking for.
And that word reconciliation
Yes.
is another way of saying compromise, isn't it?
It sure can be. In fact, especially when it comes to things like racial reconciliation, it has definitely taken on that tone, because then we're not willing to talk about restoration and reparations, because we feel like we've satisfied it with reconciliation early on. So some people that I'm in conversation with have started putting reconciliation as the last step after repentance, reparations, then finally reconciliation. All right, this is fun. All right, here we go. So Fitch uses a temple as a metaphor, and I love that he gives us that it's a people of God, that it's a dwelling place, and that it's a presence. So that means that our, whatever we call our congregating or our collective, is not a destination, right? Getting to church or meeting together isn't the destination, but a launching pad from which we go out into the world as a people, right? From that place with the presence. I love this idea. I think this has a lot of merit.
I agree. Totally.
Oh, good.
I think you preached a sermon last year about that we come to church to work out like our thoughts and our feelings. It's not just a place of refuge where we feel safe. It's a place where we prepare to go out in the world and, do God's will and be the people of God.
Yeah, I try not to use sports ball analogies because, especially in liberal churches, not everybody's into sports. So I try to minimize my number of analogies I use. But in that one, I gave myself permission to say, as a former football player, for me, the Sunday gathering is the huddle, and then we go out and run the play. Then we regather. We say, how did that go? What adjustments do we need to make? Right? And that's the breathing out and the breathing in, the low tide and the high tide, the new moon and the full moon, the spring and the winter, right? This is the constant movement of being a part of creation. And so, yeah, I think that if we saw the gathering, when we gather together, as practice, that's why we call it a spiritual practice, we're practicing for something else. It's not an end in itself. It's not a destination. We're getting ready for the thing. It's not the thing. That's why I'll just say this. That's why I'm against performance church. If church is everyone oriented in the same direction towards a stage show, it's a spectacle that creates spectators. That's why I'm into conversational church or dialogical church. It's participatory, and we say, what did you see this week? What happened in your neighborhood? What are you learning? And then we compare notes and we get ready to go back out. For me, it's a huge, massive difference. All right, I'm going to keep going.
I like it when you get fired up.
I do, I do get, you know what? Thank you for saying that. I am an ecclesiologist. I love the church. That's called ecclesiology, your view of the church. And nothing gets me more fired up than ecclesiology, talking about the church. All right. So here's the politic of fullness that Fitch talks about. It's not in lack or division, but in abundance and provision, not in scarcity and hoarding, but supply and generosity. If I were to preach Fitch's idea, that's how I would preach it. Not lack or division, but abundance and provision, not scarcity and hoarding, but supply and generosity. This comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. That'll preach, right? If we truly believed that there was enough to go around, and we walked in faith to say that if we cooperate, that we can provide more, that it's not a zero-sum game where if I win, you lose, but that together we can all end up better off, that's a very different way of being in the world. Yeah. But we live, especially inside capitalism, in a scarcity mentality that haunts us. And it has actually become an alternative spirituality. Get all you can while the getting's good.
Oh, those scam calls, huh?
Yeah.
So right now we are in the midst of scarcity, and yet I see abundance of creativity and of kindness, and so there's always more abundance when we work together.
Preach it, Linda. Preach it, sister. Go ahead.
Loaves and fishes.
Bingo. Yeah. That's the point of that story.
Yes.
It's a great story. Hey, I always try and bring something from outside the book, so here's what I'd like to end this week on. We will wrap up this book next week by his 5 practical application steps, and I think those are going to be really good for us to talk about. But with the time we have left today, I always try and bring to you something from outside the book to see if it helps inform or cross-pollinate. And so this thing he mentions a little bit, I want to expand it. So he mentions this idea. He didn't call it game theory, but he quoted a theologian who talked about bounded sets and center sets. And so I want to present to you, this is called game theory. And it's a way of how we conceive of participating in the world around us. And then I really like, my friend Doug Paget has also proposed a thing called relational set. So I want to talk to you about these 3 things: a bounded set, a center set, and a relational set. So a bounded set would be like a playground with a chain link fence. That's a bounded set. You know who's in and who's out. It has definite boundaries and a definite membership. Okay? That's bounded set thinking. A center set is like a playground without a chain link fence. And the center is the playground, right? So you don't conceive of who's in and who's out, but in which direction they're going. Are they coming towards that around which we have centered, or are they going away, right? So it's a directional way of thinking. And then this third one, the relational set, says it's not about the boundary, it's not even about necessarily the direction, but it's about how each of the individual parts relate to one another. So let me give you my example of how this has worked. I used to be part of a pastor's prayer breakfast, a once a month pastor's prayer breakfast. And when we would decide who should be invited, there was a bounded set. Which churches were sort of approved as Orthodox or Christian, and then those who were on the outside. So many of our mainline ministers in our community, whether that was Lutheran, Presbyterian, United Methodist, whatever the liberal denominations, were not invited. Okay, so that was a bounded set. So some of us proposed a center set, which says, let's agree upon something that we have centered ourselves, which is the ministry of the gospel to the people of God. And then anybody who wants to be centered on that could be invited. We don't decide who's in or out. It's a self-selecting group, right? Of people who feel that they resonate with that center and they're headed in that direction. So that's a directional approach. The relational set says, even if you don't have something that you're centered on, how you all relate to each other is the truth of your web of influence. And so instead of it being a top-down, we decide who's in, and then you can interact. Then beyond that is to say, look, we're all in this together, whether we agree or not, and that's a relational understanding. So those are three very different ways of conceiving of God's work in the world.
When we open ballots, we're always paired with someone of the opposite political persuasion. We're not supposed to talk politics, but different things come out that, in our talking conversation.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity, to relate in a, while you represent God in the world, with people that you don't agree with.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a certain level of care. You're caring for people even whom you disagree with. Because you value something greater than that, which is representative democracy.
But then I turn around and vent on Facebook, so I get it off.
Well, you know what? We're all, look, this is a growing edge for all of us.
But you're also relating to someone of a different persuasion on a one-to-one basis, so you get to know the person, and that brings that circle a little closer.
That's right. That's good. Yeah, next week we're going to talk about Venn diagrams and finding the overlap where we agree before we do anything else. Well, time has flown this morning, and we are at the end of our time, but next week we will talk about Appendix 2 and some practical steps to be taken, and we're going to talk about if those work for us or what are the challenges there. But I want to thank you for getting up early this morning and joining me here in this space.